What does it mean to be protected? For most of us, the word carries a simple promise: safety, shelter. The idea that once danger is acknowledged, once the truth is spoken aloud, a system will rise to stand between the vulnerable and the violent. Witness protection, in particular, is built on that promise. It is the quiet contract between the individual and the state. Tell us what you know, and we will keep you alive. This story begins where that promise quietly fractures. Across decades and continents, ordinary people made extraordinary decisions. They stepped out of shadows shaped by crime, war, and corruption. They chose to speak, not because they were fearless, but because silence had become unbearable. Each was told the same thing, in different languages, by different governments. You will be safe now. Your name will be hidden. Your location secret. Your life guarded. And yet, one by one, they were found. Some were killed in locked apartments with armed guards just feet away. Some were lured from safety by voices they trusted. Some died in countries believed to be beyond the reach of their enemies. A few were murdered so precisely, with such intimate knowledge of their movements, that the truth became impossible to ignore. The danger had not come from outside the system alone. It had come from within. This is not a story about a single failure or a single nation. It is about a pattern that repeats itself with unsettling familiarity. Boston, Palermo, Mexico City, London, Brussels, The Hague, Athens, Belfast. Different streets, different accents, the same ending. Witness protection is often portrayed as an almost mythic solution. A new identity, a new city, a clean slate, but behind that image lies a fragile architecture of trust. Files must remain sealed. Officers must remain loyal. Information must be shared sparingly, carefully, correctly. The system only works if no one inside it breaks. History suggests that someone almost always does. In these cases, protection did not fail because witnesses were careless or reckless. Most followed every rule. They disappeared when told to disappear. They cut ties. They waited. The failure came from betrayal, negligence, or quiet corruption, a handler who talked too freely, an officer who needed money, a supervisor who looked the other way, a document that revealed just a little too much. What makes these stories so haunting is not simply the violence. It is the intimacy of it. The killers did not guess. They knew. They knew where to wait, when to strike, how many guards would be present, which door would be unlocked, which routine would not change. Knowledge like that does not travel far without help. Over time, these deaths sent a message far beyond the victims themselves. They echoed through courtrooms, police stations, and intelligence agencies. Potential witnesses watched closely. Some withdrew their testimony. Others vanished on their own terms. A few decided that silence, however heavy, was still safer than trust. This series is not an accusation, and it is not a conspiracy. It is an examination of human systems under pressure. Systems built by people, maintained by people, and sometimes undone by people. It asks uncomfortable questions about power, loyalty, and the limits of institutional protection in a world where information is currency. At its heart, this is a human story. About courage that meets bureaucracy. About truth that collides with self-interest. About individuals who believed that telling the truth would save them, only to discover that protection is not a place, but a fragile agreement. As we begin, consider this. If safety depends entirely on trust, what happens when trust becomes the most dangerous thing of all? It often begins with a room and a question. A small office, fluorescent lights, a recorder placed carefully on the table, someone on one side holding a badge, someone on the other holding a lifetime of secrets. The question is never dramatic. It is usually quiet, almost gentle. Are you willing to cooperate? For those who say yes, the decision is rarely sudden. It comes after years of watching the machinery of harm from the inside, after realizing that loyalty only flows one way, after understanding that silence will not spare them forever. Cooperation becomes less an act of bravery than an act of survival. The system responds with assurances. There are procedures, protocols, layers of security. Identities will be erased, movements controlled, lives reorganized down to the smallest detail. New names, new jobs, new cities where no one knows the past. The architecture of protection appears solid, even reassuring, but architecture is not the same as integrity. Every witness protection program, regardless of country, relies on a fragile balance between secrecy and coordination. People must know enough to do their jobs, but not so much that the whole structure can be exposed. Files are compartmentalized. Access is restricted. In theory, no single person holds the full picture. In practice, human systems leak. Sometimes the breach is obvious: a corrupt officer taking cash, a handler too close to the people they are supposed to monitor. Other times it is subtle: a casual comment, a pattern noticed, a document filed with one detail too many. Information does not need to be complete to be lethal. It only needs to be sufficient. What makes these failures particularly devastating is that they rarely look like failure at first. Protection continues. Guards are posted. Phones are monitored. Check-ins happen on schedule. On paper, everything appears secure. The witness believes the danger has been contained. Meanwhile, somewhere else, a line is quietly crossed. An address is shared, a routine described, a location narrowed down from a list of possibilities. Criminal organizations, intelligence networks, and extremist groups do not require certainty. They work patiently, assembling fragments until the picture becomes clear enough to act. And when they act, they do so decisively. What follows is often described as shocking, but shock is misleading. These events are not chaotic. They are precise. The timing is exact, the location chosen for maximum certainty. Guards are outnumbered or absent. Doors open that should not. Calls are received that feel official. Meetings are arranged that seem routine. By the time the violence occurs, the failure has already happened. Investigations that follow tend to focus on methods. How did the attackers get in? How did they know? But the deeper question lingers beneath every report. Who knew before they did? In some cases, the answer emerges clearly. In others, it dissolves into plausible deniability and missing records. Files are classified. Testimony is incomplete. Responsibility diffuses upward and outward until no single person can be held fully accountable. For the institutions involved, these moments are described as tragedies. For witnesses watching from the sidelines, they are warnings. Protection is not only about physical safety, it is about confidence. The belief that the system values the witness more than its own convenience, more than its own reputation, more than its own informants, assets, or political interests. When that belief cracks, cooperation becomes an act of faith rather than reason. And faith is a fragile thing to ask of someone who has already learned, often the hard way, how easily promises can be broken. As this pattern repeats across borders and decades, one unsettling truth becomes harder to ignore. The greatest threat to a protected witness is not always the enemy they testify against, but the invisible weaknesses in the system meant to keep them alive. If secrecy is the shield and trust is the glue, what happens when the glue begins to fail? It started with a man who trusted the law more than his past. John McIntyre was no stranger to danger. He had grown up in South Boston, where lines between loyalty and crime were often blurred. By the early 1980s, he was neck-deep in operations that stretched from American ports to the distant coasts of Ireland. Guns, drugs, cash, the usual vocabulary of organized crime. But something changed. In 1981, McIntyre made a choice that would cost him his life. He agreed to cooperate with federal investigators, offering detailed accounts of gun smuggling to the IRA and drug routes funded by mob families. He wasn't guessing. He knew. He'd been on the boat, the Valhalla, where weapons were hidden and moved under the radar of international scrutiny. The FBI assured him he'd be safe. He was placed into witness protection. The plan was airtight, they said. His name wouldn't be revealed. He wouldn't testify until trial. No one would know, until it was too late for anyone to stop him. But someone already had. Inside the FBI was a man named John Connolly, a handler assigned to one of the Bureau's top informants, James Whitey Bulger. Bulger wasn't just a source. He was the heart of Boston's criminal underworld, a mob boss with deep roots and deeper influence. Connolly wasn't just protecting Bulger. He was working for him, and that changed everything. McIntyre, unaware of the rot within the system, continued cooperating. Connolly, on the other hand, fed Bulger the details. McIntyre's debriefings, his role in the Valhalla shipment, even the location where he was being held. The system that had sworn to shield McIntyre had already handed him over. In November 1984, McIntyre was summoned to a house in South Boston. The pretense was a business opportunity, something that would help him rebuild a life after testifying. He was led to believe it was safe, that someone had a plan to help. Instead, waiting for him were Bulger and his men. He was chained to a chair, interrogated. They asked him questions only someone inside the FBI could have provided. Specifics from confidential interviews. Details McIntyre had whispered behind closed doors. There was no doubt in his mind someone on the inside had betrayed him. When Bulger had extracted what he wanted, he shot McIntyre. They buried him in a shallow grave in Dorchester, where his body would remain hidden for over a decade. The truth unraveled slowly. When former associates of Bulger turned state's witness years later, McIntyre's story resurfaced, not as an isolated failure, but as a devastating symbol. The agent assigned to protect him had instead delivered him to his killers. Connolly was eventually convicted, not only for obstruction and racketeering, but for his role in multiple murders. But no sentence could undo what had already happened. McIntyre had followed every rule. He had trusted the promise, and that trust had sealed his fate. This case revealed more than just corruption. It exposed the inherent danger of a protection system that places lives in the hands of individuals who themselves can be compromised. It asked a deeper question. What happens when the gatekeeper is in league with the enemy? And perhaps most chilling of all, how many others, like McIntyre, never even knew the betrayal had begun until it was too late to run. In a system where loyalty can be sold, is protection ever more than a fragile illusion? The air in Palermo was heavy with summer heat the day the message was delivered. It wasn't written, and it wasn't whispered. It was detonated. Augustina Manoia, sister of Francesco Marino Manoia, a former high-ranking member of the Sicilian mafia turned government witness, died in a flash of fire and shrapnel. The car bomb that killed her was not just an act of revenge. It was a ritual, a signal, a precision strike meant to echo through every corridor of Italy's anti-mafia prosecution effort. She had been under protection. She was supposed to be safe. Her brother had defected from the Code of Omerta, the mafia's sacred silence, to testify in what became the Maxi trials, the most sweeping anti-mafia prosecutions in Italian history. Francesco knew names, drug routes, payment networks. He knew which judges took bribes, which officers looked the other way, and how heroin moved from lab to port. His cooperation was a seismic event, and the mafia, patient and methodical, waited for its moment to respond. Augustina wasn't involved. She wasn't a witness. She was simply family. But that's what made her the perfect target. Francesco had been placed in maximum security witness protection. He was guarded, isolated, unreachable, so they found someone who wasn't. Her car, supposedly checked before every use, exploded in a residential street. Investigators would later discover that corrupt officers in the Palermo police had sold information about her location, her routines, and even the security shift schedules. The implication was chilling. Her murder required not just mafia planning, but official cooperation. The people entrusted to protect her had quietly ensured her death. Francesco was devastated. In interviews years later, he would describe the betrayal in simple, piercing terms. They promised she'd be safe. They lied. But Augustina's death wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was part of a larger pattern, a slow erosion of faith in the ability of state protection to withstand mafia pressure. The same summer she died, anti-mafia judge Giovanni Falcone was assassinated with a bomb so powerful it lifted a highway into the air. Like Augustina's murder, it bore the hallmarks of inside knowledge. The message was the same: cooperation equals death. Not just for the informant, for anyone close to them. And that message worked. Fear spread like smoke through the ranks of potential witnesses. Some withdrew. Others demanded relocation abroad. A few vanished before testifying. The idea that the Italian state could shield its informants, once a pillar of the anti-mafia effort, began to look like a dangerous illusion. Augustina's murder marked a turning point. It revealed that protection programs, no matter how well funded or secure on paper, are fatally vulnerable when compromised from within. When someone with a badge decides the price is right, all the walls collapse. The truth was simple, brutal, and impossible to ignore. Witness protection is only as strong as the people running it. And when those people are bought, what you have is not protection. It's a slow countdown to betrayal. If even the state cannot protect the innocent from those within its own ranks, what does that say about the promises we make to those who dare to speak the truth? It happened before dawn in a quiet suburb outside Mexico City. The safe house was unremarkable, a low-slung concrete structure with blackout curtains and a steel-reinforced door. Inside, a man known only as Testigo Uno, Witness 1, slept under the watch of 4 armed guards. He had not left the property in weeks. Every movement was monitored, every entry logged. It was, according to official reports, secure. By sunrise, everyone inside was dead. The attack came with military precision. Multiple vehicles arrived. Gunmen moved swiftly, neutralizing guards with silenced weapons, breaching the home, and executing Testigo Uno with shots to the head and chest. It was over in minutes. 50 kilometers away, his wife and 2 young children, also under witness protection, were murdered in their own safe house within the same hour. A simultaneous strike, perfectly timed. No mistakes. No survivors. Testigo Uno had once been a mid-level officer in Mexico's federal police. Like many, he had been pulled into the gravitational force of cartel corruption, first through fear, then through money. But unlike most, he turned back. He documented everything: names, payments, meetings, routes, surveillance gaps. When he came forward, he wasn't just offering testimony. He was offering a map of the rot. Mexican prosecutors knew what they had. So did the Juarez cartel. He was enrolled in a witness protection program that had recently been reformed, an effort to counter the rising tide of cartel infiltration. His guards had been vetted. His location was classified. Yet somehow the killers knew everything: the building layouts, the guard schedules, even the weapons his protectors carried. The message could not have been clearer. Not only can we find you, we can erase you, no matter how hidden, no matter how guarded. Investigations later confirmed what many already suspected. The cartel had deeply penetrated the very system meant to shield witnesses. Several federal officers involved in the protection program were found to be on cartel payrolls. One had received bribes totaling over 10 times his annual salary. They hadn't just sold information. They had sold time. Time to surveil, time to plan, time to kill. In the aftermath, headlines mourned the tragedy. Officials expressed outrage, but behind closed doors, panic set in. Witnesses scheduled to testify against other cartels began to disappear, not from violence, but from the program itself. They fled, disappeared, or refused to speak. The pipeline of cooperation choked with fear. What Testigo Uno's death revealed was a fundamental flaw. When an institution is hollowed out by corruption, no program within it can function. You can build walls, move people, arm guards, but if the blueprint is being handed to the enemy, it's all theater. He had believed the state was finally ready to clean house. That justice was worth the risk. He was wrong. And as his name faded from headlines, the cartel's message endured. In Mexico, information is power. But giving it to the wrong side is a death sentence. If the protectors are indistinguishable from the predators, how can anyone tell the difference? It was supposed to be the safest place in Europe. The United Kingdom had granted asylum to Alexander Litvinenko, a former Russian intelligence officer turned whistleblower. He had defected from the FSB, Russia's powerful security service, after accusing it of corruption, criminal collusion, and even acts of terrorism staged to justify state crackdowns. He knew the cost of his betrayal, but he believed London was beyond the Kremlin's reach. He was wrong. In November 2006, Litvinenko met two former Russian colleagues, Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun, at a London hotel. They drank tea together, a familiar ritual among old agents. Within hours, he fell violently ill. He would never recover. Doctors were baffled. His symptoms were extreme: vomiting, hair loss, immune collapse. After days of confusion, the cause was found: polonium-210, a rare radioactive isotope, a dose so powerful it could have only come from a nuclear facility. The conclusion was unmistakable. This was a state-sponsored assassination. But the real question wasn't how it happened. It was how it had been allowed to happen at all. Litvinenko had been cooperating with British intelligence. He had helped Spanish prosecutors investigate Russian organized crime. He had published exposés, spoken with journalists, and named names. In every sense, he was a protected witness. The British government had acknowledged the risk, and yet he walked into that hotel alone. There were warnings. Russia had been increasingly brazen in silencing critics. Journalists had been murdered. Former spies had vanished. But British officials believed that Moscow wouldn't risk the diplomatic fallout of a hit in the heart of London. They underestimated not only Russia's reach, but its resolve. The murder left a radioactive trail across the city. The hotel, the teapot, the taxi, even airplanes were contaminated. Investigators pieced together the evidence with chilling clarity. Litvinenko had been targeted with surgical precision. The poison was delivered with familiarity and patience, masked by the rhythms of an old friendship. Before he died, he gave a statement from his hospital bed. He named his killers. He named their sponsor. "You may succeed in silencing one man," he wrote, "but the howl of protest from around the world will reverberate." And it did, briefly. In 2016, a British inquiry concluded that the murder was probably approved by President Vladimir Putin himself. Russia refused to extradite the suspects. One of them now sits in the Russian parliament, immune from prosecution. Litvinenko's death shattered the illusion that Western soil guaranteed safety. It revealed a new paradigm, that state-level actors, if sufficiently determined, could bypass traditional protections with ease. When a government decides someone must die and has the resources to do it, even the best-designed witness protection protocols are reduced to paper. More than anything, his death forced intelligence agencies and justice systems around the world to confront a sobering truth. Protecting someone from criminals is one thing. Protecting them from a government is another. The poison that killed Litvinenko wasn't just in the tea. It was in the assumption that some places are safe by default. That borders matter more than motives. That distance provides immunity. It didn't. If a man can be hunted, poisoned, and left to die in a hospital bed surrounded by reporters and Geiger counters, then what does protection mean anymore? When power crosses borders unchallenged, where can truth take shelter? The apartment was modest, tucked into a quiet street in Brussels. From the outside, nothing marked it as a fortress. But inside, it was a node in Belgium's witness protection network. A space meant to shield a man who had broken faith with one of Europe's most ruthless criminal organizations. He had once been part of it, an Albanian gang operating across borders, trafficking women, smuggling heroin, ordering killings without hesitation. He had seen the violence up close. He had delivered it. But somewhere along the line, something shifted. Fear, maybe, or guilt. When he came forward, he brought everything: names, locations, ledgers, police complicity. His testimony would ripple across the continent. Belgian authorities swore he would be safe. They relocated him to the Brussels apartment. 2 armed officers were assigned to guard him around the clock. The building had cameras. Entry was controlled. His location was classified, known only to a small group of vetted officials. But the wrong person had access. In March 2003, gunmen stormed the apartment. They moved fast, killing the 2 guards first, then the witness. Multiple shots. No hesitation. They exited through the same path they came in. No alarms, no witnesses, no arrests. The attack was surgical, and that told investigators everything they needed to know. Whoever orchestrated the hit knew the building layout, the location of the cameras, and exactly when guard shifts would be thinnest. This wasn't luck. This was information. Precise, internal, privileged. The trail led to a single man, a police officer with gambling debts and ties to the Albanian underworld. He had access to the protection files. He sold what he knew: the address, floor plans, even when the target would likely be in the living room, watching television. For $50,000, he traded a man's life. He was eventually arrested. The evidence was damning: phone records, bank transfers, intercepted conversations. He confessed. He was sentenced, and then the system moved on. But the witness was still dead, and the case against the Albanian network collapsed. Without him, the web of indictments fell apart. Prosecutors had built everything around his testimony. There was no backup. This wasn't just one man's betrayal. It was the collapse of an entire strategy. The case exposed something that governments across Europe had long feared but rarely spoken aloud. No security protocol, no amount of secrecy, no layer of reinforced glass or armed escort can defend against betrayal from within. Protection programs rely on discretion, on trust, on the belief that those with access are beyond temptation, but one officer with a debt and a phone can bring it all down. And so, in the wake of this murder, Belgian authorities launched a sweeping review. They found weak oversight, lax compartmentalization, poor vetting. Too many people knew too much. Too few had been watched themselves. The reforms came: background checks, segmented files, new layers of clearance. But for many, it was too late. The Albanian gangs got their message across: we can find you even here. The state's silence after the murder only amplified it. No monument, no trial for the shooters. Just another redacted name, removed from the record. When the system designed to protect you can be bought for the price of a used car, how much is safety worth? And what happens to justice when it hinges on secrets that can be sold? The apartment in The Hague was meant to be a sanctuary. It belonged to a man whose name didn't appear in court filings. At the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, he was known only as a number, a witness who had agreed to testify about atrocities committed during the Bosnian War. Mass executions, ethnic cleansing, crimes carried out not in the chaos of battle but with chilling order. He had seen the bodies. He had buried some of them. His testimony could have led to life sentences for war criminals who had once held power, men who still had loyalists, still had money, still had reach. So the United Nations put him under protection. Dutch security oversaw his housing. The tribunal shielded his identity. Everything was, officially, under control, until it wasn't. In June 2000, he was found dead in his apartment. The initial report claimed suicide by hanging, but from the start, the story didn't fit. The forensic evidence raised alarms, ligature marks inconsistent with hanging, bruises suggesting a struggle, injuries on his arms as if he had fought back. Experts found signs of strangulation, not suicide. The room had been staged. Someone had killed him and made it look like he had done it himself. The deeper investigation revealed a tangled web of failure. Despite all the redactions and layers of anonymity, someone had identified him. Someone had learned where he was living, and someone had delivered that information to people who wanted him silent. The leak hadn't come from a single traitor. It had seeped through cracks in a system that wasn't built for this kind of enemy. The Hague had underestimated the power of diaspora networks, remnants of war-era alliances, family ties, nationalist sympathies. Individuals connected to the accused still moved through European cities. Some had quietly rebuilt lives. Others had not let go of the war. Tribunal staff included people from all over the Balkans. Some still held allegiances. Some were coerced. A few were suspected of passing information in coded messages or casual conversations. In the end, no one was charged with the murder. There was no smoking gun, no clear trail. But the message reverberated through the tribunal's corridors. They can still reach us. The result was chilling. Other witnesses pulled out. Some refused to testify. Others demanded relocation, even asylum. Without their testimony, several prosecutions faltered. Justice that had been painstakingly built over years began to crumble. The tribunal tightened its protocols. Background checks became stricter. Information was compartmentalized. Surveillance was increased. But the fear remained that even in the Netherlands, even under UN protection, a witness could be murdered in silence. This was not just a failure of logistics. It was a moral rupture. The world had promised to hold war criminals accountable. It had built an international court, assembled legal teams, printed glossy reports. But one man had died alone in a room that should have been unbreachable. And no one could explain exactly how it happened. When protection collapses under the weight of politics, prejudice, or complacency, justice becomes a performance, something that looks real until the lights go out. In the shadow of war, with truths too dangerous to speak aloud, who will dare to testify next? And who will promise to keep them alive and mean it? The heat hung low over Manila when the call came in. It was early evening in August 2017. A man, known only to the public as a confidential witness, answered his secure phone, the line given to him by the Philippine Department of Justice. The voice on the other end identified itself as his protection officer. Calm, routine. A new security briefing had been arranged, they said. A car would not be necessary. The meeting point was nearby. He stepped outside his apartment, unarmed and unworried. Minutes later, he was dead. Two men on a motorcycle approached from behind, a tactic so common in the Philippines it had earned its own name, riding in tandem. They fired at close range. multiple shots to the head and chest. He died on the sidewalk. The man had been under witness protection because of what he had seen and what he was willing to say. He had once worked with the police, identifying suspected drug dealers and users as part of the country's brutal anti-drug campaign. But over time, he began to document what couldn't be explained away: raids that ended in execution, evidence planted after the fact, officers celebrating kill counts like trophies. When he came forward, he provided testimony that could have transformed human rights investigations. He named officers, described orders, exposed patterns. The government had told him he'd be safe. His location was secret, his identity sealed. He had followed every instruction, moved into the protected unit, kept to the rules. And yet the killers had known where he was, and when he would be alone. What unraveled in the weeks that followed was a portrait of deception wrapped in bureaucracy. Investigators traced the phone call to a number within the Department of Justice. But when they tried to identify the caller, they found nothing. No record of the call being authorized. No officer claiming responsibility. No paper trail. Someone inside the system had impersonated a protection officer. Someone with knowledge of his schedule, his location, and the internal workings of the program. The implication was devastating. The witness hadn't violated protocol. He had obeyed, and it got him killed. Human rights groups called it a state betrayal. Officials insisted he had acted carelessly. The truth, however, was visible in the blood on the sidewalk. The protection program had been compromised, not by neglect, but by active subversion. And it wasn't the first time. Several other witnesses connected to the drug war, either informants or relatives of victims, had been murdered under similarly suspicious circumstances. Some had left protection voluntarily, others had been uncooperative. The pattern was clear, even if no one in power would admit it. The effect was immediate and chilling. Remaining witnesses withdrew. Some fled the country. Others refused further cooperation. The pipeline of testimony, already fragile, cracked. In authoritarian systems, where law enforcement is both the accused and the protector, the conflict of interest becomes lethal. Justice becomes a closed loop, and witnesses become expendable. This case was not about a single man. It was about the idea of accountability, and whether it can exist in a system that silences those who seek it. When the voice that calls to protect you is the same voice that lures you to your death, what hope remains for truth? And in the absence of trust, how does justice survive at all? He believed he was finally beyond their reach. After years inside a Colombian drug cartel, he had escaped not just the country, but the life. He had flipped, testified, exposed routes, money trails, and names. His cooperation had led to arrests, asset seizures, and multi-million-dollar drug busts. In return, the U.S. government gave him a new name, a new city, and a new start. He was now part of WITSEC, the U.S. Marshal Service Witness Security Program, considered the gold standard of protection. And still, in June 2009, he was shot dead outside a grocery store in a quiet city in the southeastern United States. The attack was clean, professional. The shooter approached from behind, fired multiple times, and vanished into a waiting car. There were no warnings, no threats, no second chances. The killing stunned authorities. WITSEC had a nearly flawless record. Its protocols were meticulous. Witnesses were relocated with extreme care, their names erased, histories buried. The program's mantra was simple: disappear completely. So how had they found him? The investigation uncovered uncomfortable answers. First, the witness had made mistakes, minor ones, but fatal. Despite explicit instructions, he had placed a few brief calls to his mother in Colombia. Short, infrequent, but traceable. Cartel intelligence units, increasingly sophisticated, had been watching, analyzing, mapping phone tower data. Over time, they narrowed his location. But that wasn't the whole story. Federal court filings, meant to be redacted, had included clues. Mentions of relocation in the southeastern U.S. Hints that, when read alongside other documents, painted a faint but usable picture. The kind of picture a determined adversary could reconstruct. Then came the most disturbing thread. A paralegal working for a defense attorney in one of the drug trials had conducted suspicious online searches. Cities in the southeast linked to witness protection, combinations of the informant's old name with new locations. While the paralegal denied wrongdoing and was never charged, the information somehow made its way to cartel intermediaries. Whether sold, shared, or stolen, it was enough. The witness had done nearly everything right. He'd lived quietly, avoided contact, kept to himself. But the system around him had not held. The murder exposed an overlooked vulnerability in even the best designed programs. The legal system itself. Court filings, plea deals, defense preparations, all required some level of disclosure. And each of those disclosures was an opportunity for leakage, however unintended. It also revealed a darker truth. The cartels weren't just armed. They were informed. They had analysts, tech experts, and money, enough to turn speculation into confirmation. They didn't need a name, just a pattern. And once they had it, they acted. The U.S. Marshals tightened protocols, training was revised, legal teams were warned. But the breach had already cost a life. And with it, a case. Several other witnesses involved in the same network backed out. Some returned to Colombia. Others vanished into silence. For WITSEC, the case was a rare stain. For others watching, it was a warning. Even in America, even under the best protection available, information could leak. Systems could fail, and enemies could wait when intelligence becomes weaponized and safety depends not just on hiding, but on total silence. What happens when the world refuses to forget? Is any new life truly possible when the past is only ever one mistake away from finding you again? It was called a secure facility. In Athens, a former member of a radical Greek terrorist group had been taken into custody after agreeing to testify against his former comrades. He knew the names, the safe houses, the bomb makers. He had seen blueprints for attacks on government buildings, police stations, and foreign embassies. His testimony was a breakthrough, a rare crack in the wall of silence that protected violent extremism in Greece. He was moved to a holding unit under police control. Not a prison, but a controlled location with 24-hour surveillance. His cell was suicide-proof, they said. No fixtures, no exposed cords, constant monitoring. A place where nothing unexpected could happen. And yet, in April 2013, he was found dead. The official story was quick and familiar: suicide by hanging. Bedsheets, improvised noose, tragic end. But within days, the story began to fall apart. Forensic pathologists found injuries inconsistent with hanging. Defensive wounds on his hands, bruises on his chest and neck. The sheet itself wasn't long enough or strong enough to support his body weight. And most damning, the only place in the room high enough to suspend a body was inaccessible without assistance. The message was clear. This wasn't suicide. It was murder. Investigators began tracing access logs, surveillance records, and visitor reports. What they found was chaos masquerading as control. Gaps in security footage, unlogged comings and goings, officers who couldn't remember details, a rotation of guards, some of whom had ties, direct or familial, to nationalist and anti-state groups sympathetic to the very cause the witness had betrayed. No single person was identified. No charges were filed. But the conclusion was inescapable. Someone had either killed him or opened the door and looked the other way. In Greece, political violence has long walked alongside history. Extremist organizations, Both far left and far right have drawn support from ideological corners of society. The witness had broken from one such group, and in doing so violated a code more sacred than silence: loyalty. His murder was more than retribution. It was a signal. Even inside, even under guard, we can reach you. The consequences rippled quickly. Other potential witnesses withdrew. Prosecutors scrambled to salvage cases built around testimony that would now never be heard. Trials collapsed. Convictions slipped away. The network of accountability broke, not because of lack of evidence, but because fear did its job. What this case revealed was the vulnerability that ideology brings into security. Unlike criminal organizations that operate for profit, political extremists often inspire silent sympathizers. People who may never join a group or commit a crime, but who might quietly decide a witness deserves to disappear. Protection in such a world becomes more than just logistics. It becomes a test of loyalty, not from the witness, but from those assigned to guard them. And in a society fractured by belief, that loyalty cannot always be trusted. When even the cell built to save you becomes your execution chamber, what does protection mean? And when ideology infects the very people sworn to guard the truth, how do you measure the cost of silence? The facility in Belfast was fortified, monitored, and cloaked in secrecy. It had to be. The man inside was a former IRA operative, now turned supergrass. That British term, supergrass, wasn't casual. It described someone whose testimony could dismantle entire networks. Dozens of names, years of operations. The kind of evidence that could change the war on terror from attrition to prosecution. He had been arrested in 1981. By 1982, he had flipped. He spoke about weapons caches buried under farms, meetings in shadowed pubs, bombs assembled in backrooms. He gave investigators a roadmap of the provisional IRA's inner machinery, and in doing so, signed his own death warrant. British authorities promised him safety. He was placed under guard in a secure Royal Ulster Constabulary RUC facility. The trial that would follow was set to be one of the largest mass prosecutions in Northern Ireland's history. Over 40 names. One man's words. But then, in November 1982, he was found dead in his cell. The official report labeled it suicide by hanging. Authorities claimed he had grown despondent, overwhelmed by guilt or fear. But his family contested that narrative from the moment they heard it. He had shown no signs of despair. He was making plans for his life after the trial. He'd been upbeat in visits. And then there were the injuries. Bruising that didn't match hanging. Cuts that suggested a struggle. Marks on his wrists, as if he'd been restrained. Decades later, declassified documents revealed what many had long suspected. The IRA had informants inside the RUC. Officers with Republican sympathies, family connections, divided loyalties. Intelligence reports had warned of vulnerabilities. That the facility wasn't as airtight as it claimed to be. Those warnings were buried. Some officers may have simply turned a blind eye. Others may have allowed access. A door unlocked, a shift change unnoticed, a silence maintained. The specifics remain unknown, and no one was ever charged. But the weight of evidence pointed toward one conclusion: he had been murdered, not despite protection, but through its failure. His death derailed everything. The mass prosecution collapsed. Without his testimony, cases disintegrated. Suspects walked free. The promise of a new strategy, prosecuting terrorism through witness cooperation, evaporated overnight. Worse still, it sent a brutal message across the sectarian divide. Cooperating with the British government was not just dangerous. It was hopeless. Other potential supergrasses refused to come forward. The program itself was discredited. The idea that testimony could be exchanged for safety now seemed like a cruel joke. This wasn't just a case of institutional failure. It was a case of institutional illusion. of believing that facilities and procedures could override history, ideology, and community. In Northern Ireland, loyalty ran deeper than uniform, and betrayal wasn't just punished, it was remembered. The facility that should have represented order, protection, and justice became a silent tomb. And the man who trusted it discovered too late that the walls weren't designed to keep danger out, only to keep him in. When the war outside your cell follows you into the heart of the system meant to protect you, what's left to believe in? And when your truth dies with you, who carries it forward? 10 stories, 10 promises broken, 10 lives erased. They were supposed to be protected, not as a favor, but as a guarantee. The systems that offered them shelter were built on law, protocol, and trust. Each program, whether run by the FBI, UN, or local police, operated on the same principle: speak the truth, and you will not die for it. But they did. Some were found because of money, a bribe exchanged in the shadows of a precinct, a bank deposit wrapped in silence. Others were undone by ideology or carelessness or sheer institutional arrogance. In every case, what should have been confidential became currency. What should have been guarded became vulnerable. The failures were not just logistical, they were philosophical. John McIntyre followed the rules and was sold out by an agent sworn to protect him. Francesco Marino Manoia trusted the state, and his sister paid the price. Testigo Uno's entire family was murdered before he could take the stand. Litvinenko drank poison in a London hotel. Witnesses in Brussels, Athens, The Hague, and Belfast died within systems designed to keep them alive. Each story was unique, but together they formed a pattern, a quiet, damning rhythm of betrayal. These were not moments of battlefield chaos. They were not random acts of violence. They were breaches of trust, executed with precision and aided by those inside the very systems designed to prevent them. And what of the consequences? Investigations were launched. Reforms were proposed. A few were arrested. Some programs changed their protocols. Others simply moved on. The names of the dead faded from public memory, replaced by case numbers, redacted documents, or lines of classified text. But behind the scenes, the message was received. By every potential witness, in every country, cooperation is not protection. Telling the truth may not save your life. It may endanger those you love. And the people asking for your trust might not be able or willing to protect you when it matters most. That message lingers. It floats through courtrooms, prison cells, refugee shelters, and interrogation rooms. It hardens hearts, silences mouths, and in doing so, it protects the powerful, not through force, but through fear. Because when people believe that speaking out leads only to silence, the truth becomes its own prisoner. The tragedy of these 10 cases is not just that lives were lost. It's that justice itself was robbed, quietly, efficiently, and without consequence. What remains is a question too heavy to ignore. If the systems meant to protect the truth become the very reason it dies, what do we have left to believe in? And how many more must be sacrificed before protection means what it promises? They trusted the system, and the system failed them. From Boston to Palermo, Manila to The Hague, their stories form a quiet indictment, not of a single agency or country, but of a deeper truth. Protection is not made of steel doors or security cameras. It is made of people, and people, under pressure, break. The idea of witness protection has long lived in our collective imagination as a solution, a clean slate, a second chance. But in reality, it is a fragile arrangement that depends entirely on discretion, integrity, and the absence of compromise. When even one link in that chain gives way, lives are lost. This journey through 10 murders is more than a record of individual tragedies. It is a meditation on vulnerability, on the limits of law in the face of human failure. Some of the witnesses were idealists, others reluctant. Some sought redemption, others survival. All of them believed in a promise, that truth could be spoken without being fatal. They were wrong. The common thread was not recklessness or betrayal on their part. It was betrayal by the systems they served. A handler who sold secrets, a prosecutor who trusted the wrong aide, a file too loosely redacted, a shift change logged by someone compromised. Each death echoes the same refrain. Secrecy is not enough. Geography is not enough. Rules are not enough. Only trust, sustained and guarded with care, makes protection real. But trust, once broken, is not easily repaired. And in the aftermath of these failures, the cost extends far beyond the graves. Justice delayed, cases collapsed, institutions discredited, future witnesses silenced before they ever speak. We want to believe that good systems can withstand bad actors, that layers of oversight will catch the flaws, that the weight of the law is enough to deter betrayal. But these 10 cases suggest otherwise. Where power and secrecy meet, corruption can flourish. And when justice depends on discretion, discretion becomes its greatest risk. So what now? We reflect, we redesign, we tighten protocols, review clearances, encrypt data, relocate staff. We promise to do better. But the harder task lies in rebuilding trust, not only within institutions, but among the people who still stand at the edge, holding dangerous truths and wondering whether to speak. For them, these stories are not history, they are warnings. And yet, even in this bleak landscape, there is a kind of hope. Because each of these witnesses, though in their own way, believed that truth mattered more than silence. They risked everything not for glory, but because something inside them refused to stay quiet. And in their courage, we are reminded of what is still possible. Protection, when done right, is not just about secrecy. It is about honoring that courage with care, vigilance, and integrity. It is about keeping promises, not just in words, but in action. And perhaps, most of all, it is about asking ourselves, what kind of society are we if we cannot protect those who tell the truth? Until we can answer that question, with more than silence, the ghosts of the unprotected will remain, not just in memory, but in warning. They trusted us. We must do better.